just that it's a very nostalgic setting for my guest today, Dr. Manmohan Singh. Welcome to Walk the Talk. And interesting to have you here in Delhi School of Economics, where you taught for 3 years. And I think a whole lot of people you taught have then gone on to run India's economic policy, corporations, so much.
Well, I have very fond memories of having been a teacher in the Delhi School of Economics. I think some of the most valuable friendships of my life were made during this period. Professor A.K. Sen, Professor Sukumar Chakravarti, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, and a whole generation of younger economists who have since then made phenomenal contribution to the...
In fact, you've brought many of them into the policy structure. Many of them have then run India's economy.
Well, yes, I think Bimal Jalan was one of the persons I picked up for the Ministry of Finance when I became Chief Economic Advisor. Monte Kaluwalia was another distinguished economist whom I brought to the government. Rakesh Mohan is yet another distinguished person whom I brought.
Who's now Deputy Governor of RBI.
Governor of the Reserve Bank. And even among the IAS, I think I picked up a large number of talented young people to work for me when I was in the Ministry of Finance.
But Dr. Singh, tell me something. Economics you taught here between 69 and 71, before that in Punjab University, at Oxford, and later lecturing on commerce and trade. It was very different from the economics you practiced when you became finance minister.
Well, times have changed. In the 50s and 60s, there were very few people in the world, including people in the West, who differed from what India was trying to do. Those were the days of Rostov's takeoff into self-sustained growth. That all that you need for an economy to take off was a large dose of public investment, and thereafter the economy will look after itself. We had, I think, in the late 50s, an MIT project. The MIT people were closely involved in planning of economic policy in India, and there was no difference between our planning commission and the advice that came from distinguished economists of the MIT.
That was sort of East Coast academic advice, because the US economy was taking a different direction.
Well, I think obviously nobody would say that India's problems are the same as the problems of the United States. I think that was the period when most people believed that in developing countries, because of the lack of adequate development of the entrepreneurial skills, private sector limitation, public sector had to be the lead.
But sir, when did you realize that this had changed? That maybe some of what had been taught to you or some of what you had taught was either a myth or that times had left it behind?
No, it was not a myth. I believe what India did in the 50s and early 60s laid the foundation of what has happened to India since then. If Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had not invested in modern temples of India, the massive irrigation project, the public sector investment in steel, the institutions of higher learning, the Department of Atomic Energy, space program, India would not be able to reap the benefit of globalization that we are now able to claim in the changed environment of the 90s.
Doesn't take me back to 1991, the summer of 1991. What exactly happened? You know, when you were actually in the hot seat.
Well, I had no indications that I would be called upon to become the finance minister. I had come back from the South Commission, and India was then in crisis. Mr. Chandrasekhar was the Prime Minister. He asked me to help him as an advisor to the Prime Minister. I saw at that time that India was in the midst of a deep crisis, and I started thinking what to do about it. In my convocation address at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, long before I became Finance Minister, I set out the elements of a stabilization, calm structural adjustment program, which I thought India needed. But I had at that time no indication.
But sir, when did you realize that Indian economic thinking or the whole idea in the way India's economy was managed now had to make such a big turnaround? I won't say an about turn, but such a big change.
Well, I was convinced by the early 70s when I became Chief Economic Advisor. I think the first paper that I did for Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was what to do with the victory. And at that time I said that we had gone too far in imposing unrealistic control structure, that liberalization of the private sector, liberalization of the economy was required.
So you first recommended the end of license quota Raj in,
I do claim
in the early 70s?
Early 70s. In fact, in the paper that I wrote was in 1972.
Right.
And soon after, I think the gradual process of...
But you got the chance of putting that into effect 20 years later.
Well, I think I was a civil servant, I was Chief Economic Advisor, I was also Secretary Economic Affairs, then I became Member Secretary of the Planning Commission, and people don't remember, I was one of the persons who took part in the formulation of both the 6th and the 7th plan. And these were the only plans where the growth targets were more than fully implemented.
In 1991, when you took over, just describe the crisis to me. When you became finance minister, how bad were things at that point?
Well,
I believe we had foreign exchange for not even for a week's imports.
India's foreign exchange reserves had been exhausted. People who had lent money to Indian banking system, they wanted their money back.
Right.
And if we had gone that way, we would have to impose such drastic import control that there would have been unimaginable increase in unemployment. A sharp increase in inflation was already evident. When we came to office, prices were rising at a rate of about 20% per annum, and our system does not tolerate high doses of inflation.
And India would have gone into anarchy at that point.
Yes, exactly. I think what we faced was a complete breakdown of the economic system of India, the type of things which happened in the Soviet Union, for example, or Eastern European countries.
How close were we to that?
Well, we were very close to that.
A few days, a few weeks?
I think a few weeks. As I said, our foreign exchange reserves were no more than $1 billion, that is 2 weeks imports. Non-resident Indians who had kept money in our country were withdrawing their money. The Indian banking system had borrowed some short-term money from the international banking system. Those bankers wanted their money back. The aid donors were not willing to give aid to India. Yashwant Sinha, when he was finance minister, he went abroad to Washington, to Tokyo, but I think he drew complete blank.
Nobody was willing to help.
Nobody was willing to help India.
So was that the shock treatment we needed to start changing?
Well, maybe. I think we are a democracy, but we are also an indisciplined democracy. A crisis concentrates the mind probably as nothing else. But when I became finance minister, in the very first week I said India is in the midst of a deep crisis. We are going to convert this crisis into an opportunity.
So this crisis is almost as serious as maybe the 62 war against China, when the country could have collapsed.
Well, the country's economy would certainly have collapsed, and the politics then could not also be saved.
But would you say that this was the greatest period of the greatest crisis in India's economic history, independent India's economic history? Or do you see any other moment that was comparable?
Well, I think we had, a crisis of the foreign exchange in 1957-58.
Right.
We had, 62 events that you mentioned. But in terms of, the consequences for managing the Indian economy, the 1991 crisis was probably the most severe crisis.
Dr. Singh, tell me a few things you did at that point, because your government had just come in, you had to get your vote of confidence, you didn't have full majority. So what were the sort of emergency measures you took, like the equivalent of pumping steroid and oxygen into a patient?
Well, the first thing that I came to realize was that India's exchange rate had to be changed. Now,
it was too high?
Well, I think the rupee was at an unrealistic level. We had to change the exchange rate, we had to depreciate the rupee. But changing the exchange rate in India has always been a political problem.
Right.
And here was a government which was a minority government. Here was a government which had yet to win a vote of confidence. I went to the Prime Minister and I said, we cannot wait till we get the vote of confidence.
Because in India, the popular mind, we link the value of the rupee with national pride.
That's exactly. So I think the first thing that we did was to adjust the exchange value of the rupee in 2 doses. Now, I had to do that because there were difficulties in going the straightforward way.
Right.
But
What is the straightforward way?
The
Announcing a
straightforward
devaluation.
But I think cabinet was not prepared.
Right.
There was opposition from the president. He said, well, you don't have a government which has yet to win a vote of confidence. So how can you
President
do
was Mr. Venkatraman.
Mr. Venkatraman. So we found a way out. I instructed the Reserve Bank to announce a new intervention rate. After a few days, I asked them to repeat it, and the result is we brought about a devaluation, a depreciation of the Indian rupee.
Without announcing a devaluation.
About 25%.
So
The world got a message that here was a government which, despite being a minority government, was able to take toughest decision.
So-
And if you remember that the decision to adjust the exchange rate in the 1960s, I think the decision could not be taken over a period of 3 years.
this is early 60s.
Early 60s. All these decisions in the past.
Until Morarji Desai came, I think, and
No, I think the World Bank had proposed a depreciation of the Indian rupee in 1962. Ultimately, it was done in 1966.
Right.
In between, there was tensions within the government. The government was not able to take decision. But within 10 days of the Narasimha Rao government, we took some of the most difficult decisions. Take, for example, the adjustment of the industrial licensing policy.
Right.
We abolished the license per metrage within 1 month of our government, and I was able to report in my first budget speech that India had now a different...
now was that a signal you were giving to Indian businessmen
Both.
or to international lenders and institutions?
Both to Indian businessmen and to international creditors.
Right.
I think we wanted a regime which would value enterprise, which would value risk-taking, and we wanted to create an environment in which even the foreign investors would have confidence that India now welcomes
So tell
foreign
me something
investors.
about your exchanges with Mr. Narasimha Rao. Did he understand the need for change economics? Because both of you were brought up in a socialist milieu.
Well,
He more than you.
Well, Mr. Narasimha Rao was most supportive. Without his active backing, I could not have done anything.
But he knew the risks.
Well, he knew the risk, and he told me that if the thing succeeds, we will all claim credit. If the things don't work, well, you will be sacrificed. And I was prepared for that.
So you were marked out as a likely scapegoat if this
Yes,
happened.
I think I realized that right from the beginning.
Were there moments when you had doubts, when you thought this can go wrong or this is going wrong?
Well, I had some doubts when I presented the first budget.
Right.
We had, I think, cut subsidies very sharply. In
Right.
fact, in my very first budget in the history of India, this has never been done. We reduced the fiscal deficit of the central government by full 2 percentage points of the GDP.
Right.
This has never happened.
happened.
Before, this has never
and
happened.
that brings its own pain.
And therefore, we adjusted food subsidies, we adjusted fertilizer subsidies, but then there was pressure from Parliament, and the government developed cold feet, and at that stage I protested and I gave my resignation to the Prime Minister. I said, if you are going to go this way, then I am not able to, I think, serve.
So either follow your convictions and the path of
Path.
reason or forget it.
But I must say that Mr. Narasimha Rao backed me to the hilt, I think, in the first 2 years of our government.
Sir, there are those who say that this was like Dr. Manmohan Singh's re-education. He learnt and taught something else all his life. He was a socialist, and then when crisis came, he made a complete turnaround.
Well, let me say, I have been always a socialist in the sense that I regard a quest for equity, quest for social equality as fundamental to running a modern economy and modern society. If by socialism you mean a passion for equity, a passion for equality, I am a socialist even then. But I have never been a socialist in the sense, in the doctrinaire sense of the term,
So-
that all things must be done by the government.
So are you a socialist now or not?
I am a socialist in the sense that I worry about growing inequalities. I worry about the fact that millions of our children coming from poorer families are outside the school system, that millions of our families do not have access to safe drinking water. In that sense,
So Dr. Singh, what is it that this government is doing by way of reform that you disagree with?
well, first of all, let me say that I do not agree the way this government is handling the problems of the public sector. This is a government which is, for its ideological reasons, wants to dismantle the public sector. Our view is public sector should be allowed to grow if if public sector can compete on an equal footing with the private sector. That profit-making public sector units, if they can compete, should be given every opportunity.
But why
to
shouldn't
grow.
they just become private? I mean, what's the harm? Why should government why should government run companies?
Because there is a distinction between private profit and public profit. When public sector companies make profit, those profits become, I think, the asset for the nation to expand further investment. I think where are resources for education, for health going to come from?
So, what else do you disagree with without?
Well, the other thing,
besides the public
other
sector.
things that you say, although this government talks of deregulation, but it is a case-by-case deregulation. There is no consistent hand moving
Although
in the same
sometimes
direction.
when your government was there, it was called suitcase by suitcase.
Well, I think suitcase by suitcase, people ended up in the BJP, Mr. Sukhram.
But that's how politics is, isn't it?
But what I'm saying, if you ask me what is the difference in the approach, our approach to deregulation is a principled approach. We would like a rule-based system, a rule of law rather than a deal-based system.
Is that what you do if you come to power?
Yes, of course.
And so are we going to see a much more institutionalized reform, deregulation, privatization?
Exactly. And we will come out.
You are still committed to all that.
Yes, of course.
This Congress
we are
party is
committed
not
to it.
making an about turn yet again
No,
on economics.
no,
just because the BJP took credit for reform.
No, the BJP never believed in reform. After all, in 1996 or 1998, they came with the slogan, India to be built by Indians. Their charge against was that we were selling India to foreigners. Now you look at it. I think the other day the finance minister announces private sector banking up till 74% of foreign equity.
Right.
Now this is not what the BJP fought its election. It fought its election on so-called Swadesh. Now it is doing something which is totally different from.
That's what politics is. You say
No,
one
no.
thing but do quite another, isn't it?
No, but I think you can't carry this process beyond a certain point. You must, I think, carry conviction with the people that you are sincere, that you have thought through the problems of this country. Otherwise, social and economic change in a country of India's complexity, of India's diversity, cannot be carried forward in a meaningful way.
Is there anything this government is doing that you not only agree with but you endorse?
Well, I
it
think
may be peace with Pakistan or China, it may be
Well,
economic reform.
Well, first of all, let me, as far as peace with Pakistan is concerned, our party has had a structured approach. We have always been in favor of talks with Pakistan. Even at the height of Kargil war, we were in favor of talks with Pakistan. Whereas, what is the consistency of this policy? The Prime Minister one day talks of Arpar, the other day he mobilizes 1 million people, then suddenly there is a change, he goes to Jammu and Kashmir, he says Insaniyat. There has been no consistent hand as far as this government is concerned.
What is it that this government has done that you endorse? Tell me one or two
Well,
things.
I think one thing I would say, for example, the National Road Program is certainly a
National Highway Program.
But also, I would say the fact that although they came to power on the slogan of Swadeshi, I think they have, over a period of time, not dismantled, the reform structure that we had set up. I think,
and on that you seek consistency if there is a change of government in next elections.
how can we one sure? I think, how does one know tomorrow the RSS, for example, would allow the government
well, I mean, that is you're saying if NDA comes back to power, RSS may block it. But if you come to power, you will not reverse it. You will continue
we will
with
not
it.
reverse.
So,
When I became finance minister, I said we are going to produce a model of adjustment and structural change with a human face, and I said we will show to the world that there is a humane way of dealing with problems.
So if your party or your coalition was to come to power, are you promising us even better and even faster reform?
Of course, reforms which will address the problems of poverty, reforms which will address the problems of our farmers, reforms which will address the problems of our working classes.
Right. So what is it that will change in the current scheme of things if you come to power?
As I said, we will have a more consistent...
Are you going to stop privatization of public sector, PSU?
We will not stop privatization of loss-making public sector units.
Right.
But public sector units which are doing well, which can compete against the private sector, both domestic and foreign, we will give them all opportunities to expand. But that doesn't mean that these public sector enterprises cannot disinvest. If they want to raise money in the capital market, we allow them to do
But
so.
government will not give up control. And then the same would apply to nationalized banks also.
Well, we are against, I think, against a system where the banking system will be entirely in the private sector. We would, the Congress government nationalize the banking system. We would like the Indian banking system
To remain that way?
to remain up 51% in the hands of
Government
in the government.
So we talked about the change that you had, the change that you saw from socialist economics to economics of the 90s and then onwards, and what you're talking about now. Now tell me also about the re-education of Dr. Manmohan Singh in politics. From
Well, I
academia to politics. I'm sorry to be asking this
when I
in the library of Delhi School of Economics, but
No, no,
it's
when
an
I
interesting
came
point.
to politics, I thought this is an opportunity for me to convert good economics into good politics.
Right.
That has been my effort. But I have come to realize that politics, after all, is the art of the possible. And sometimes you have, therefore, to make compromises. Also, I came to politics with the belief that we must have a long-range vision, that we must look at India's problem from a long-term perspective. But I have come to realize in politics, a week is sometimes too long a period of time. So politicians...
And economics works in 5-year plans and so on. But sir, it's always said that good economics, it was said good economics doesn't make for good politics. You think it still is true, or you think it should continue to be true?
No, I think if politics is to be the instrument of social change, if politics in this country has to serve the people of India to get rid of chronic poverty, ignorance and disease,
Then it has to follow good economics.
Then it has to be based on good economics. We have to create more wealth, we have to distribute that wealth equitably.
So
these are the twin imperatives.
Tell me something, you work with many leaders in India, leaders of the Congress party. As a party man, as well as a civil servant, as an economic advisor, how do you compare Sonia Gandhi with Narasimha Rao and Rajiv, or Mrs. Gandhi before that?
Well, of course, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was the most towering personality. I think I have worked very closely with Mrs. Gandhi. I worked very closely with Rajiv ji. I've worked very closely with Narasimha Rao ji. Now, each one of them, I think, were men and women of exceptional ability, character, and convictions.
Right.
And they have served India with great distinction. Sonia ji, I think she is new to politics, but in the last 5-6 years that she has been the leader of our party, I think she has given the party a lead which has helped to unify our people.
So what is the brief from her to you? What are you to achieve for the Congress party and for her in this campaign and beyond?
A progressive, expanding economy and socially just policy.
Because we somehow don't identify you with the din and dust of elections. Are you going to campaign?
Well, I should campaign. I'm a member of the Congress party, and I will be campaigning.
And are you going to contest?
Well, that I have not made up my mind.
But that is what Pramod Mahajan, he has an interesting term, winnable candidate. In some sense, you're not a winnable candidate because you did so much for the middle class in India, and yet South Delhi defeated you. Middle class is so ungrateful.
Well, I have no, regrets, and I am not putting the blame on middle class or anybody else. Maybe there was some defect in me.
But are you game if you are asked to contest again in this election?
Well, I have not made up
or you think that is not for you?
I am not made up my mind on that.
But you are going to campaign from the front.
Of course I should.
But that is the difference between a politician and an academic. There must be areas where you disagree with your party.
Well, I think when you are a member of a party, you have to abide with the party discipline. But I think that also means that there are areas where sometimes I think you have to, accept the party decision even when you feel that I think that's not the right decision.
Right. But at the same time, you think that you will have sufficient sort of moral and intellectual strength to keep the party in the right direction, whether it wins the election or it doesn't, in terms of having a sensible view on economic reform. And
I think there is no doubt about it. The Congress party under Mrs. under Mrs. Sonia Gandhi in the last 5 years has stood by the reform. There are important reform programs, let us say, for example, opening up the insurance system.
Right.
It could not have been possible but for the support of the Congress party. The new electricity bill, which is a reform-oriented bill, it would not have been passed but for the support of the Congress party. The Congress party's record is that when reforms are in the interest of our nation, we have backed that reform.
So whether the Congress wins or loses, nobody should see any threat to the larger reform process in India. You think that has come to stay?
Of course, I think everybody is...
As a citizen, investor,
Well,
taxpayer,
let
I
me
should have no insecurities.
Let me say that we are the original reformers, we are better reformers, and our commitment to reforms with a human face, to work towards a new India free from the fear of war, want and exploitation, there should be no doubt about our total commitment to that goal.
So on that note, I'll wish you all the very best in the coming campaign, and I hope our politics sees the kind of reform that our economy has seen over the past decade.
Well, thank you very
much.
much.
And for that to happen, you have to be around in front.
Good, thank you so much.